Good morning to others on the West Coast. My name is Ray O'Brocki. I'm the Manager of Fire Service Relations for the American Wood Council, as Marcy said. Before that, I did 23 years in the Baltimore City Fire Department. I retired as the Assistant Chief of Administration, and I was also the Fire Marshal for Baltimore City. Before coming to the Wood Council, I also was the Chief Building Official for Rockville, Maryland, which is a small city right outside of DC. The program today is Demobilizing Construction Sites Safely using NFPA 241. It's my pleasure to be joined by Lieutenant Chris Towski of the Cambridge, Massachusetts Fire Department. He's their Construction Fire Safety Compliance Officer and a principal in NFPA 241. So nobody knows 241 better than Chris. We are the American Wood Council. We are not the marketing wing of the wood industry. We deal in codes and standards and research. We do manufacturing, environmental regulations, and advocacy and public policy, but we do not market wood. We basically write chapter 23 in the IBC, that'd be the wood chapter, and we provide education to building and fire officials around the country. And that will take us to our first poll question.
All right, so let me launch that for you. As always, we like to know who is with us, and I give about 30 seconds to have you tell us. And no matter what your profession, we are delighted that you're here and hope that you find something of value. This morning's webinar, we had a much more diverse crowd. And it looks like that actually may be the case for this afternoon as well. It's kind of interesting to always see the different percentages here. So let me share. We have, let me move this so I can see. We have 37% engineers, 28% code officials, 17% fire service, and 12% builders, manufacturers, others, and 5% architects. Again, no matter your profession, we are delighted that you are here.
Okay, thanks, Marcy. Now you know who we are, and we know who you are. Let's talk about some of the things that we're going to discuss today. Before I get into the actual course description, I just want to let you know that this is not just for wood construction site. This is for any construction site that is going to be shuttered due to the COVID-19 virus. Construction sites around the country are being shut down. The abandoned and unprotected construction sites pose an unacceptable risk to the community. During this shutdown, it is the goal, or should be the goal, of the fire service and the building department that builders leave their construction sites as reasonably fire safe as possible. I think it's also in their best interest to button these things up before they shut it down. The program provides guidance that is based on the International Fire Code, NFPA 241, the International Building Code. But the codes never contemplated a massive shutdown of construction like we're seeing. So to talk about how we can use these codes to demobilize safely, we have to discuss the codes themselves. So during the course of the program, you're going to see and hear code language that's going to sound like active construction, and it might even refer to active construction in a couple places. That's because the way the code is written, and we can't talk about using these standards and codes as guides for demobilizing if we don't talk about the actual code language. So I just want to explain why some of the language might appear to be referring to active construction, and we're going to sort of flesh that out as we get through the program. This program also is not advocating for the shuttering of construction sites. That is a local decision made by local elected officials based on local circumstances. So I don't want to give the impression that we're saying these sites have to be closed down or they should be closed down. This is simply dealing with, once the decision is made to close these sites, this is the best way, or these are the best practices for demobilizing them. Also, let's move on. So in the event of a shutdown, It is recommended that jurisdictions give builders time to finish the building envelope if possible. If they're close, they can do it. Make arrangements if they cannot button this building up to protect the exposed wood from weather. If it's possible, to activate the fire protection systems if they are in place and they can safely be activated if weather allows it, if it's in a conditioned building. You just want to give the builders enough lead time to demobilize safely and deliberately and take advantage of whatever fire protection features are ready to be put online. Some of these could be installing or finishing fire compartments. You could either permanent or temporary fire compartments to limit fire spread if something was to happen. Address protection of door openings, windows, shafts, service penetrations. Provide temporary fire alarm system if that technology is available to the builder. Provide separation distances between adjacent buildings or temporary buildings. Now, while this program is geared towards sites that are shutting down, the National Association of Home Builders has construction job site safety recommendations on their website. This is for jobs that are not going to be shut down. The plan describes how you can prevent worker exposure to coronavirus, protective measures to be taken on the job site, personal protective equipment and work practices, controls to be used, cleaning and disinfecting procedures, and OSHA guidance on what to do if a worker should become sick. At the end of this program, this is being recorded. This program is going to be parked on the Construction Fire Safety Coalition website as well as the American Wood Council website. But I do urge you to go to the Construction Fire Safety Coalition website, which is constructionfiresafety.org. They have these free resources there. We're going to try to put a section up just for demobilization after today to give some templates and guidance on how jurisdictions can proceed and even builders. We also have a companion Facebook page where you can ask questions and get live answers in real time. So these are our learning objectives for today. We're going to look at risk and hazards associated with construction sites, focus on the hazards that can occur during a shutdown. We're going to look at the codes and standards that safeguard construction, best practices, and even talk about a little of the code language, identifying housekeeping procedures, equipment, flammable and combustible materials, and other hazardous activities and materials on a job site. Also, we're going to talk about a lights out plan, identify steps to take before shutting down the site to ensure fire safety. So we're going to first review a couple recent construction site fires, talk about owner's responsibility, what the code says about safeguarding construction. We're going to focus on site security for obvious reasons, fire department access requirement, water supply, and then Chris Towski is going to come in and talk about, among other things, the quote-unquote lights out plan for builders and what they need to do and what they're doing in Cambridge. The one thing we're really lucky about today is having Chris with us is Cambridge, Massachusetts actually is shutting down construction in their jurisdiction, and they are actually going through this. So this isn't an abstract exercise. This is real life practical advice and what they are requiring of their builders prior to turning the lights out. Also, he's going to discuss fire department pre-incident planning for the shutdown as well. So while this situation is unprecedented, construction fires are sadly not. This is what the NFPA has reported happening every year around the country on buildings under construction and major renovations and demolitions. These are big numbers, but compared to the total amount of fires, they make up about 1.7% of all fires. But they get a really disproportionate amount of press coverage, and also they do a disproportionate amount of economic development damage to a community. I just wanted to review some significant fires that occurred during construction, just to give you a little background on the problem. I picked two fires in particular, one in Bound Brook, New Jersey, and one in Wilsonville, Oregon, because these were both fires that occurred off hours and were ruled incendiary. The first fire, Bound Brook, New Jersey. This was the Meridian, Maine. Was a 174 unit apartment building. It was a 2-story concrete podium with 4 stories of wood frame above it. It wound up to be a 7-alarm fire. The thing that made this particular fire unique was the fact that if you see to the right, the picture to your right, the stair tower to your right was a separate construction site, and the fire actually jumped the street. That's what the radiant heat from that fire caused the second fire in that place, which was the Mosaic, I believe, and that was another construction site that was lost. This decimated downtown for about a week and a half. We had to cut the power off, shut down a commuter rail line. This was an arson, and the New Jersey State Fire Marshal's Office made an arrest very quickly. It was the site security here was basically a weighted base fence that the fire chief up there called flimsy. It did not have a fire watch, although it was ordered to have a fire watch. The arsonist gained entry fairly easily and lit off the combustibles that were available to him. The second fire, which is Wilsonville, Oregon, happened in 2019. This was another fire that was a total loss, and it jumped a very wide street. That street there is a very wide street and damaged the surrounding exposures. It happened at 1 in the morning. To jump back to the Bound Brook fire, that occurred on a weekend in the evening. So both of these fires occurred off hours. Both of these were ruled incendiary or arson by the investigators. This one had radiant heat that melted 14 vehicles. It was a 4-story wood frame building, had 20 units in the apartment. So one thing to put in perspective when you're talking about mitigating hazards on a construction site is what I like to call the 3-legged stool of effective firefighting, which is one leg of the stool is fire department access, one is water supply, and one is early notification. So if any construction fire safety plan or any demobilization plan is to be formed, these 3 considerations should be paramount. And I do believe that every item should fall under one of these 3. And the way a 3-legged stool works is if one leg is missing, the stool cannot stand. So you need all 3. 2 is not good enough. You need all 3. And this will take us to our first poll question. Marcy.
Sorry about that. I couldn't get my mute. All right, which element is not part of the 3-legged stool of effective firefighting? Is that fire department access, water supply, early notification, or none of the above? All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it. So we have 88% none of the above. What do you say? Is that the right answer?
Well, 88% were paying attention because it is none of the above. Fire department access, water supply, early notification are all part of the 3-legged stool of effective firefighting. So to understand the risk and hazards, it's no surprise that to anyone that construction sites can be an unsafe environment. There's a lot of moving parts. There are ignition sources smoking materials, cooking, open flames. Now these obviously, most of these apply to active construction. They're all viable ignition sources during active construction. But I think during a shutdown, arson and intentionally set fires are the biggest concern. And notice I said I separated arson from intentionally set fires, because not every intentionally set fire is an arson. Let me explain. In Baltimore City, where I did most of my professional fire prevention in my life, we had a problem with the stealing of copper wires, copper pipe. The copper wires were particularly troublesome because the people who stole them would burn the wire insulation off on site, and a lot of times cause fires. These were, you couldn't consider that exactly arson, but they were intentionally set fires. In a downturn in the economy like we are seeing with this crisis, you're going to have more people out of work, potentially more homeless. You might have people trying to live in these construction sites where they could start a fire by cooking, by open flames, trying to keep themselves warm. These are all intentionally set fires, but not necessarily arson. But the cure for all of this, arson or intentionally set fire, is good perimeter security. And of course, you have sources of ignition paired with sources of fuel, combustible refuse and trash, building materials, flammable gases, flammable liquids, packing material. All of this could still be on site if they just simply chain the gate shut or turn the lights off and just sit this shutdown or wait this shutdown out. But the fire prevention on these sites really starts with the owner and builders. They are the ones responsible. They should be taking the lead on this. And you know, in an active construction site, the owner has responsibility to create or maintain a safe work environment. In fact, that should be their primary responsibility. Well, during a shutdown, they are not relieved of that responsibility. They still have the obligation to create a safe environment. And they should do this through a comprehensive management policy that starts at the top. They should have the highest priority on fire safety, the building owner and the general contractor. And they need to work closely with the AHJ, AHJ meaning authority having jurisdiction, to ensure all regulatory requirements are met. Now, I'm not really going to do this much, or probably not again in this program, quote a code section directly out of the code, but this is important. A fire safety program shall be included in all construction, alteration, or demolition contracts, and the right of the owner to administer and enforce this program shall be established even if the building is entirely under the jurisdiction of the contractor. Okay, the owner must designate a person who will be responsible for the fire prevention program and authorize them to enforce its provisions. Now, what this is saying in a nutshell is, even if the building is completely under the jurisdiction of the contractor, which means, you know, I'm in Baltimore and the owner lives in sunny Florida, that owner is still responsible. They cannot abdicate that responsibility. I just want to turn it over to Chris to talk a little bit about the fire safety program and the future of the fire prevention program manager. Chris.
Hey, thanks, Ray. Good morning and good afternoon, all. Thank you to American Wood Council for having me again. Yeah, the point I just wanted to make here was trying to give you my perspective, where it's, you know, how we've done it here regionally up in the Northeast, specifically the Cambridge, Massachusetts area. So I'm not sure how it's been in your community, but up my way, no one has ever looked at this seriously until about 5 years ago. That's when up here in Massachusetts, we adopted the NFPA 1. And in there was the first pullout that talked about fire safety. It's taken that long to get to where we are now. We still have a long way to go with spreading the word. We have a long way to go with educating our fire service. And we still have a ways to go with getting the buy-in from the construction industry. There's essentially two parts to this. There's that education piece, and then there's going to be the enforcement piece. And I think as we tie this in later on, where we never thought we'd be using this particular document on a demobilization aspect. I think it'll all start to come together for you. Thanks, Ray.
Thank you, Chris. And these are the issues that should be addressed in a fire safety program, and by extension through a fire safety plan. And you're supposed to have a program and a written plan. All the following should be addressed: good housekeeping and site security, big time issues for a demobilization plan, but also for a regular standard construction plan, fire safety plan. Fire protection systems, we're going to talk about the disposition of these fire protection systems as construction progresses, or the disposition when construction ceases or temporarily suspends itself. Training of employees, that's for active construction, but development of a pre-fire plan with the local fire department. This is important because this would also include a demobilization plan that would include all the above: rapid communications, consider special hazards that are specific to that construction site, and then protection of existing structures from exposure fires. So this program manager has responsibility, and obviously training would be for active construction, and the weekly self-inspection, authorized planned impairments, supervision of hot work, more towards active construction. Although I think it would be wise for the owner to have weekly self-inspections, even on a shuttered site, because you can get a feel if kids are sneaking in, if the fence has been cut, if they've broken in. It shouldn't just be left sitting idle. But the most important of these responsibilities when it comes to a demobilization plan is development of a pre-incident plan with the local fire department. And this would include, like I said, the demobilization plan. There are also responsibilities on the fire suppression, the firefighters out there. And I often get asked questions, well, what codes and standards, what legal authority do I have to enforce these construction safeguards? And my answer is these. There would be Chapter 33 of the International Fire Code, Chapter 16 of NFPA 1, the Fire Code, Chapter 33 of the International Building Code, and sort of the grandfather of construction fire safety safeguards is NFPA 241. This is not a new standard, it is an old standard, first adopted rather, or approved in 1933. It's not a huge standard, it's only about 20 pages, that includes the appendices. It's not highly technical, it's an easy read. It is, and if you are in an IFC jurisdiction, you might think, well, how can I enforce an NFPA standard? Well, when I was in Baltimore, we used the IFC. In fact, they still use the IFC. And in Chapter 33 of the IFC, 241 is referenced. So basically, if it's referenced in a model code that you've adopted, it is adopted by reference. So you would have the legal authority to enforce any of the provisions in NFP 241. Chris, since you're a principal on 241 committee, is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, thanks, Ray. Again, my perspective that I'd like to add is we're conversely, we're the opposite of you folks in Maryland, what we do up here in New England. We're an NFPA state. We're still following the IBC, and then how to even find safeguarding construction anywhere in there. Once you get into the IBC, you're looking real deep into that book. You're going way deep into Chapter 33. Most people don't go that deep when they're looking for fire safety stuff. They have a tendency to stop at Article 9 to get their answers. When people do go up that high, they're looking for the security, the fencing, and making sure that the excavating, the steel plates generally don't get into the fire safety side of it. The fire safety side of it's always been pretty much being self-policed, look at that aspect. But the beauty is though is that the IBC does point fingers to the IFC. Here in Massachusetts, we don't follow the IFC. Through state legislation, it gets pointed to the 527, the Fire Prevention Code here, which Hence, as I mentioned earlier, we adopted the NFPA 1 back in 2015. So in there, in that chapter 16, that's where, being an extract document, it pulls out some real good stuff out of 241. And just as you said, Ray, 241 becomes adopted by reference because of just that fact. With that, going fast forward, what we've done on committee, where we're headed for the revision for the 2022, we're pretty much revamping the document. Hopefully it's a much easier read for the end users, and that's being all inclusive, the end users being the owners, the construction workers, and for the fire service. So hopefully we'll have it laid out in a much better format. Thanks, Ray.
Thanks. So the authority having jurisdiction, their responsibility are really a team effort. You have the building department that enforces construction codes, the Fire Prevention Bureau, which enforces the fire code, and the Fire Suppression Division that does pre-fire planning, maybe site assessment of the water supply. For a demobilization, it also should be a team effort. You should have the building department making recommendations, if not requiring certain conditions to be met, also not issuing building permits. You have the Fire Prevention Bureau, which would be enforcing 241 and coming up with demobilization requirements. And then you have the Fire Suppression Division that will create a pre-incident plan during the shutdown. And hopefully they work together. Unfortunately, traditional roles of at least the building department and fire prevention bureaus creates a gap in responsibility. Building department thinks, well, the fire department does fire safety, not us. The Fire Prevention Bureau says, well, we don't inspect things that's new construction until they get a certificate of occupancy, then we take over the fire inspections. So the building department should do the fire safety stuff until that time. So in that gap falls bad habits and lack of fire prevention in what I call the responsibility gap. And this will lead us to our third poll question. Marcy.
Yes, indeed. Which model code does not safeguard construction? NFPA 1, IFC, NFPA 1620, or NFPA 241? Okay, let's see what the answers are here. All right, 77% say C, NFPA 1620, and 12% say B, IFC, but just a little bit on the others. So why don't you tell us what the, why don't you tell us what the real answer is there, Ray?
The answer is NFPA 1620. While NFPA 1620 does not provide provisions to safeguard construction, it is relevant. It is the NFPA standard for pre-incident planning, which is a guidance document to fire departments on planning, pre-incident planning. So if there's going to be a fire, we plan on how to handle it before the fire. Even though NFPA 1620 applies to buildings that are already constructed, if you wanted, as a fire service member, to have some guidance on what things should be in a pre-incident plan for a shuttered construction site, that would certainly be a good place to start. Now I just want to look at best practices. Some of these are not codified, but maybe will be in a future cycle. However, they address things very important issues, some things that are codified, and so regarding site security, housekeeping, hazardous materials and processes, and things like that. Once again, these are geared towards active construction, but they can inform your demobilization plan. And to me, the one of paramount importance is site security. So this is what the code says about site security. Guard service shall be provided when required by the AHJ. Security fences shall be provided where required by the AHJ. Entrances to the structure under construction must be secured. If you are required to have a guard service, they have to be trained in notification procedures, the function and operation of fire protection equipment. They need to be familiar with fire hazards and the use of a construction elevator. Now, all these have to be specifically required by the authority having jurisdiction, or the default setting is you don't have to do it. Now, places like Los Angeles and other places have decided to switch the default setting, where they make it mandatory unless you don't have, that's the AHA says you don't need it. So in these jurisdictions that have changed the default setting, you have to have a guard service unless they tell you you don't. You have to have perimeter fencing unless the AHA says you don't. And I think for a shutdown, it would be prudent to require perimeter fencing where practical. You should have a site security plan based on a security assessment in your demobilization plan, and for that matter, in your standard construction fire safety plan. And it should include personal observations, log books, video technology, scheduled patrol routes, proper notification, and the site security plan based on local conditions might take into account whether it is an urban setting or it is a rural setting or a suburban setting. I went to a fire, and I'll show you some pictures of it in a minute. There's a fire in Long Neck, Delaware, and it was an incendiary fire. And I asked the fire marshal about the fire, and he told me that particular area of Delaware was the opioid epidemic capital of Sussex County. And so that could be factored into your security assessment. If you're in an area that has that problem, you might want to ramp up security measures. There's a lot of factors. I'm not a security expert. Site security, if you look at site security in the context of this statistic here, in 2019, there were 27 multifamily construction fires. Out of the 27 multifamily construction fires, 16 were reported in the media as suspicious. So it is feasible that incendiary or intentionally set fires are on the rise. And the only way to combat these fires that are intentionally set is through good perimeter site security. This is actually a picture of the fire in Long Neck, Delaware I was telling you about. There were 3 of these buildings, 3 of the garden style apartments, and none of them had fencing prior to the fire. This one, they were putting up the fence after the fire, and they still didn't fence off the other 2. So it seemed like sort of closing the barn door once the horse got out, putting up the fencing after the fire. But here's just some final thoughts on security, site security. There's video and artificial intelligence out there for line monitoring. We suggest that you have a real fence surrounding the site, secured into the ground or pavement, not a weighted base temp fencing that can easily be pushed aside. You can take a belt and suspenders approach to this by having live guard service and the video technology. I would put signage around warning people that there is video security and that you have no expectation of privacy to deter anyone who might want to try to test the security of your construction site. And the last thing I want to talk about before I turn it over to Chris is separation distances. There has to be adequate separation distance between buildings under construction and temporary construction buildings, like construction trailers or storage sheds or spotted pots, that kind of thing. There's one table in all of NFP 241. I just have like an example that if you have 20 feet of temporary structure exposing wall length, you would need to be 30 feet away from the building under construction. But you get a 75% distance reduction if the temp trailer is sprinklered or the temp structure is sprinklered. You could even require they remove the temp structure. However, I think a construction trailer would be an excellent place for, if you're going to shutter these sites, to have the plans, the keys, the construction plan, the demobilization plan. You have all this stuff so that the fire service, if there's an incident, they know, go to the construction trailer, here's where the keys are, here's where the plans are, and they can use that as their command posts if it's practical. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris to talk a little bit about housekeeping. Hey, Chris, you there, buddy? Okay, so while Chris works on his, you got it, Chris?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Ray. I'll give you a little break now. You've been chatting for a while. All great stuff to this point, and we just want to keep that going. But honestly, folks, if we could boil NFPA 241 down into one word, this is the segment here. It's the housekeeping fashion. You know, most construction folks, when they go to their construction college, they teach that industry how much to, you know, with managing, saving time and money. They very seldom, if at all, touch on fire safety. As I mentioned earlier, they pretty much leave that to others, whether it's an OSHA-driven rule or some other construction owner, you know, the owner of that construction company, for them wanting to keep their folks healthy. They have some other rules that are in place. Very seldom, though, do folks take this holistically as a whole thing. So it's the best housekeeping practices. It's keeping that refuse and processed waste, keeping it clear of the property within reason. It's keeping the scrap and emptying that debris daily. It's keeping all the packing materials. You know, typically what we see a lot is when the projects get to their 11th hour, as they've really amped up trying to get to that finish line, when all the other products that come in, like the cabinets or whatever, and all that packing, where does all that go? A lot of times it just finds itself just stuffed in a hallway somewhere. But who's there that's going to manage that and keep that housekeeping in check? And other, of course, you know, the items of the oily rags, so there's no spontaneous combustion, making sure they're in their own approved recycled receptacles. So storage places that are accessible for the fire service side of it. I mean, how nice would this be? You know, if we could keep everything right out in front to keep things free and available. We want to do our best to clear spaces around the materials, keep the alleyways open. What we have here is the gangways, keep all that stuff in check. So it's a nice free flow. You know, it's a game of inches with a lot of this stuff and checks and balances. You know, the construction workers, they need to do their part, but they also have to keep in mind that should something go wrong, that there's clear pathways to escape and for the fire service to have access to. You know, it'd be nice, the perfect world, to have dumpsters located 50 feet from a building. I don't know how it is in your community. We don't have that luxury here in the Northeast, certainly in our urban areas. We're lucky if we can keep the combustibles out of the building. That has its own challenges, just trying to maintain keeping the non-combustible waste in check. And certainly if there's any sprinkler systems, anything that's fire protection related, folks need to be mindful to not have any obstructions to those. So should they need to be used, that they're in a working condition. Electrical equipment. Very fortunate being a licensed electrician, being in that trade for the last 35 years, seeing the electrical industry come a long way. And certainly where we've come just in the, I don't know, the last 10 years or so with getting away from incandescent lighting and going to LED. So on that aspect, a lot of that lighting, the heat coming from the lighting isn't there, but there's still some other things that are going on, certainly with extension cords. We're seeing some things taking place with battery charging storage. They give off their own heat. Sometimes they're sitting confined inside of combustible shanties or little rooms that were built. So we want to make sure that folks are keeping a good check on those type of heat sources. Certainly, report anything that's faulty, take it out of service, get it identified, get it thrown away. Waste, that's probably going to be the biggest Achilles heel to a lot of the folks out there. you know, the scrap stuff. Where does it get stored? Ray mentioned something earlier that I found pretty humorous, that he was familiar with one particular site that they used a whole room of the project just to store the scrap pieces. I haven't come across that. Usually a lot of people will take it, or they just leave it on the floor, but to actually see it stored in a particular room, of course, us on the fire service, we start thinking of fire load. You know, when is it actually going to leave that area? Another one that's pretty interesting is the vegetation. Not something we have an issue up here, but I'm sure some of you folks, especially in the warmer climates, if you have a lot of brush on your sites, keeping that in check so it doesn't become part of the problem. And finally here, let's not introduce a problem. If they're not already burning, let's not give them a reason to. You know, for that waste that's there, let's not burn it on site. Let's dispose of it differently and get it off the property, off the premises. Interesting photo here. Shows how the combustible storage is way off to the distance. Again, not in my region. We don't have that luxury here. That's perfect world stuff. Hopefully you folks can deal and manage with that on your end. I find it interesting that the storage container, though, was smack dab right in front of the hydrant, pretty much making that unusable. So you can see that some folks, they'll do what you tell them, and if they're only being told to keep the storage a certain distance away, sometimes they're not hearing the full message, and they're not catching wind that, oh, what access really means to the fire protection features, hence that hydrant. I mean, we see that a lot with fire department connections. Just in their own design, a lot of times they're being tucked away, but here it is, now they're being blocked by some type of construction material. And construction, combustible materials, certainly want to have them controlled. Again, you'll hear a lot about security. Talks about the guard service. Fire detection systems. We talked about this in the earlier program. This is a great thing for folks to really get proactive into. Certainly some stuff taken outside the box. There's a lot of technology out there that can be used these days, especially, you know, things that are wireless of that nature. There's a lot of mix and match that can be done. On the fire extinguisher side of it, not just having the extinguisher, but making sure that the extinguisher is there for the ready and it's the right extinguisher. We want to protect all ignition sources. And then the flammable liquids and combustible and the gases side of it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but as you can see, what's not covered in the NFPA 1 or an NFPA 241, there's some other referenced items here, and that will push to, you know, some of the other NFPA documents that will help you folks make your decisions on managing those products. All right, thanks for that. I'm going to turn it back over to Ray.
Thanks, Chris. I just want to talk a little bit more about built-in fire protection features, especially in your demobilization plan or in the fire department pre-incident plan. You have to know the disposition of these features because they aren't effective until they are complete. So you need the condition of the fire stairs, access stairs, fire protective materials, automatic sprinkler systems, those dispositions, whether or not the fire compartments are completed, fire doors, penetrations, and general protection of other openings. Now, these are all code sections here. These aren't best practices. You have to designate a suitable location as a command post to provide with plans, emergency info, keys, and communications. As I said earlier, a construction trailer is perfect for that if you have a site with a construction trailer. Every building must be accessible by a road with an all-weather driving surface of at least 20 feet of unobstructed width. Now, for new developments, these are baked into the cake. Infill lot construction, you pretty much can't count on this. But like I said, if you have a big project that also did a lot of site work, they should and are required to have this. Any dead-end roads of more than 150 feet must include a turnaround. Access roads must be within 150 feet of all exterior first floor wall surfaces. Access interior access. They have to provide at least one usable stairway at all time, and has to extend upward as the building, as each floor is complete. The stairway must be lighted. It has to be enclosed once the exterior walls are complete, and there should be signage that will identify the stairwell, the floor, exit path. Standpipes are easily the most important fire protection feature for a building under construction. They come online before the sprinkler system, before the detection systems, and they are vitally important if a fire should occur. It's the easiest and quickest way for the fire department to communicate and convey water to upper floors. It's that important. And it is also a code requirement. So you have to install at least one standpipe prior to construction exceeding 40 feet within one floor of the highest point of construction. So basically, the building has to go up, but the standpipe goes up with the building. Now, does this mean that you start the standpipe when the building hits 40 feet? No, it does not. Buildings of 40 feet or more are required to have a standpipe. So the standpipe needs to go up as the building goes up. So the minute you hit the second floor, you should be working on that standpipe on the first floor, and it goes up with the building. It's the most common misinterpretation of the code there is, that somehow you have to wait until it hits 40 feet before you put the standpipe in. The fire department connection, the FTC, has to be conspicuously marked and has to be readily accessible. And you have to have one hose outlet on each floor, and they have to work. This is very, very important. And just as you saw the earlier slide, where a storage container was blocking a hydrant, make sure that you don't have roll-off dumpsters, building materials, anything that obstructs or obscures a fire department connection. One of the legs of the three-legged stool is water supply. And this is what NFPA 241 says about water supply. Fire protection water supply, temporary or permanent, shall be available once combustible material accumulates on site. Where underground water main or hydrants are to be provided, they shall be installed, completed, and in service prior to the start of construction. I don't know whether that takes place where you folks are from. I can tell you in the Mid-Atlantic, it almost never takes place for brand new construction where they have to run a new bulk feed. It usually comes somewhere along the line. If you're in a jurisdiction that requires this and accomplishes this, great. If not, there has to be provisions made. Now, this is what the IFC says about water supply. An approved water supply for fire protection shall be made available as soon as materials arrive on site. So they tell you that it's required, but they give you no guidance as to fire flow, either code. So what is an approved water supply? Well, basically, it's whatever the fire service or the fire AHJ says it is. This is a one local interpretation that I found, requiring 1,500 gallons a minute at 25 PSI with one hydrant 500 feet from any combustible materials, and the contractor is responsible to keep it going. 1,500 at 25 PSI, is that going to get it? I can tell you the fire in Bound Brook that I previewed earlier, the incident commander told me they were flowing 40,000 gallons a minute. So this is one of these things on what the AHJ is comfortable with. And this will lead us to our fourth polling question. Marcy.
Here we go. All right, the code requires at least how much of an unobstructed width for fire department access roads? 15, 20, 25, or 30 feet? Okay, let's share that. So we have 67% say 20 feet, and 14% say 25 feet, 12% 30 feet, and just 6% say 15 feet. So let's find out which is right.
It would be 20 feet. And that's 20 feet of unobstructed width. And Also, the code requires 13.5 feet of unobstructed height if you have an issue with height. I'm going to turn this back over to Chris, and he's going to talk about some of the real life requirements, not suggestions, that Cambridge, Mass. And his fire department are making construction sites do prior to their shutting down. Take it away, Chris.
All right, thanks again, Ray. Thanks, folks. I'm gonna take a little bit of your time now and just, again, like Ray said, give you a real life how it worked for us. Ray had mentioned earlier, we're pretty fortunate in the Cambridge area that we have somebody like myself that's able to keep a set of eyes on what's going on. Not every fire department has that. Hopefully more will be able to do that. Sadly, our fire departments are being maxed out in all different directions right now. So good luck to the folks that are the boots on the ground right now for what they're doing there. But for the folks that can go get to this point anyway, and you're trying to, especially, you know, in your municipalities or your own communities, you certainly want to try to have a hand in on what's going on with those construction sites. For us, we got the same notice that the contractors and the owners got. Once we received it, we were given that same timeline. They had a week to demobilize. How it worked for us was it essentially started with Department of Public Works. They sent out the first moratorium, the work stoppage for any excavations in the street, and to get any vehicles like boom apparatus and that nature, have them taken away. That trickled into the building department, and then the building department came out with their own guidance, and it ended up being a joint letter that was issued by both the DPW and the Inspectional Services Department, the building department. Again, they come out with, here it is, folks, go make your site safe, and you got a week to do it. They did have some somewhat flexibility in there for folks, you know, to get that accomplished. But in a nutshell, most people were given 5 business days to move on. So once that come our way, we certainly didn't want to see that have another problem out there. So we wanted to make sure that we worked with these folks. Again, like I said, so they didn't walk away from the property, and then now we were left with a fire problem. So an email, two different emails went out. One went to, like I tried to mention earlier, you know, the old Rolodex. I scrambled looking for contacts to figure out who I could get in a hurry that could spread the word. And we did that to the contractor side. And then the second part of this is what we did with an email that went out to our fire folks. But that went out to the contractor's end. We let them know we're here to work with you. However, you need to do some things for us. And those would be that if you haven't kept your contact information current, now's the time to do so. Have it in an upfront place. If your site is permitted with a fence, then on the outside of the fence, or if there's a way that we can get into the fence without cutting the locks. If they daisy chained in, we use the Knox system. So if they use the Knox padlock, I had a Knox box that had key access. So we could readily get in there to get to contact info, to get to fire alarm enunciators, to get to the those things, you know, being important in nature. We let them know if you had anything stored around that site in the access areas, if they were in front of doorways or in the roadways, they needed to be cleared out. That included vehicles. Anything that they had going on in the property, certainly if it was a wood floor, if they had a hole in that for whatever reason, or if they were doing some stuff and they had some shaftways, they needed to close those up within reason. So if nobody was around, of course, and then we were doing some fire mitigation, nobody fell through. We took it one step further and told them politely that covering up concrete holes, you know, concrete floors that have, you know, passageways, holes in them, it wasn't enough just to do it with plywood. You know, rated plywood maybe within reason, maybe having another layer of a non-combustible product in the middle to give it some type of equivalency rating, if you will, to make it that much safer. As you heard, security is a must. It's sometimes, though, for the fire folks that are listening, it may be a little bit counterintuitive. Now, here it is, we want to keep everybody out, but keeping everybody out also keeps the fire department out. So how do we work through that? Now's the time for those folks to get their security force up and running, get them making sure that they got folks that are pretty well versed and trained into things on the fire side of it, where they can recognize fire and how to call for help. The utilization of security cameras, using the technologies that are out there. Some folks maybe even have to use a combination of both, well, however it would work. They needed to monitor what was going on in the infrastructure that was already there. Things like electrical and gas service, what their status was, were they ready to be shut down if need be? How could they be controlled if nobody's there on site to help direct the fire department to that part? We even took it a step further when we talked about the beauty is we're coming out of the heating season. So any of those temporary fuel-based heaters, have them not only take the fuel away with them, but take the heaters away with them. It's not something that needs to be there anymore. Anything that was in place, depending on where that project was, if there was any fire alarm devices that were ready to, that were taken offline, that they get restored, any fire suppression features. Now would be the time where if it had no protection, to think about using technologies to get some protection in there for an interim basis. The dumpsters, you heard it in this program several times about the waste, and we'll say it here again. The dumpsters needed to be emptied of combustible waste. No need at all just leaving those there on site. They're not going to do any good just having that there. So now is the time to do a final emptying, get that product removed so it doesn't add to any fuel load. Any combustible materials that were stored inside, now is the time to think about having that relocated. Maybe they could go into storage sheds outside the property. So again, to keep that fire load down. And we took it one step further when it came to the flammable and combustible liquids and gases. We made an absolute that they had to be removed. There was some pushback from some folks because logistically for them to get a vendor out there to make that pickup, to get it relocated off the property was going to be a little troublesome. But we worked with them, and from all the sites that we had going on, everyone that I'm aware of was able to get it done. So things can work. And then the second side of this is what we did with our fire companies. We want to make sure that our fire folks out there were as safe as possible. We were fortunate several years ago, we built off a program we already had, and because it was electronic based with using iPads and things like that, for tracking and stuff, there was some things that they could do. We gave them some other tools so they could still, in their daily routine, who knows whatever routine means these days, but while they're out and about, they should still keep their eye on construction sites, and they could use their iPad to still make some notes, so they'll have reminders, things to watch for. But what we did guide them though is everything that they're going to do here on in is all going to be from the outside. They're going to have to do their best to try to imagine what's going on the inside, do their best to get a 360-degree set of eyes around it, including the roof, and even if that involved throwing like an aerial ladder so they could see what's going on up there. We've instilled our own policy that we have of the social distancing, making sure that they adhere to that, so they're keeping their 6-foot minimum spacing if they do encounter anybody that's around. And we did tell them pretty much, if there's no emergency going on that site, there's no reason to enter it. Hands off, stay out, and just gather whatever information you can from that outside. We gave them some other key things to look for, the hydrants. I agree 100% with Ray, and maybe we'll make that a change for 241. Fire flow is not tabulated into the documents that we have, and that's definitely an issue when we get into, combustible construction types. But outside of that, have them look for the colors. We use the NFPA color coding system up our way, so that can give them some type of idea how much water they may have available. We're giving them some stuff they'll have to make their decisions early on if they're going to do something offensively or if they're just going to go right into a defensive mode. What's going on around them with their exposures, any potential exposures, how they're going to place their apparatus, not only for collapse, but if things start falling out of the building. You know, if we do have one of those properties that is a type 1, type 2 building, but it has some combustibles inside and there's some wind moving that product around that might be on fire, where is it going? The apparatus placements are also going to be key for fire attack, whether it's offensive or defensive. We talked about the structural collapse, how they're going to be mindful of that. Getting a good eyes where that project is, you know, especially a lot of our existing buildings that are doing like tenant fit outs, you know, being mindful of where those sprinkler and standpipe connections are so they can get early water in there. The fire alarm enunciator panels, and being mindful of that construction site. But again, now's a good time, you know, especially when they're coming out of the ground. That's the time you get to see how they're being built and what they're being built and made out of. That'll give you a better understanding of what your enemy might be. And now I'll turn it back over to Ray.
Okay, and this leads us to our fifth and final polling question, Marcy.
Yes, it does. And this is a true-false question, so 50-50. Before shutting down a construction site, all holes and openings in floors, roofs, and shaftways must be secured. So this is hopefully a pretty easy one. So.
Yeah, as you can see, we haven't made these polling questions that challenging. It's really to reinforce what we've said, the important things, and also to keep people engaged and interested.
Yeah. All right. So let's go ahead and see what the folks say. So 98% say true. And I got to agree with everybody.
And they're right. It is true. You need to protect those openings. So in conclusion, we went over risk and hazards and talked about the hazards associated with a construction site sitting abandoned or vacant. We reviewed the safeguards in the codes that covers construction site safety. We reviewed best practices, and we talked about how to mitigate those risks with best practices and code sections. And then Chris did an excellent job of talking about lights out planning. We went through the components of a well-prepared plan for when you have to demobilize construction site. So that leads us to
Marcy. This is Michelle Camberon, Senior Director of Education for American Wood Council, and I'll be going over some of the great questions that we received while the webinar was going on. Let's see. The first question here is, what if we use the IFC and not NFPA 1? How do we enforce provisions in NFPA 241?
we talked about this in an earlier slide. 241, NFPA 241 is referenced in both the IFC and the IBC. So even if you haven't adopted NFPA 1, if you have a standard that's referenced in a code you have adopted, like the IFC, then you essentially have adopted it by reference and it is enforceable.
Right.
In fact, I think that in the IFC, the exact language is one of the code sections. It says anything not covered in here that's covered in 241, you have to follow.
So that sounds great. And someone had mentioned that, and I don't know if this is correct or not, but you can verify this. There is very broad language that allows the fire marshal the ability, discretion to cite the utilization of any NFPA standards as they choose necessary in the IFC.
Yeah, I think every code, the IFC I know has one. They're usually parked in the 100 section, and sometimes they're referred to as a catch-all that fire marshals, and I believe there's a section in the 100 or the chapter 1 of NFPA 1 that says basically the fire official can do basically what's necessary if they come across a hazard that's not explicitly covered by their code.
Mm-hmm. Good. Here's another question. Do construction sites need a fire prevention plan in place during the shutdown?
Absolutely. In fact, they probably need it then as much, if not more, than when there's active construction going on. There has to be a plan. If you look at NFPA 241, the section that I read, it says very clearly that you have to have a fire safety program, which also includes a written plan for all alteration, new construction, and demolition contracts. Doesn't say active construction, active demolition, active alteration. It says for a contract. So if there is a contract to do construction, you have to have a plan, whether you are actively constructing or not.
Mm-hmm. Good. Another question. What agency will be the one enforcing the shutdown?
Because Chris is up there in Cambridge and they're actively doing this, instead of me speaking abstractly about it, I'm going to let Chris answer this one of what they are doing.
All right, thanks, Ray. Yeah, Michelle, how it's played out over here, and I think a lot of communities are going to be faced with this, it's going to be multifold. I think the enforcement, where it's a fire safety thing, will most likely default to the fire official, but things are going to start maybe with the building official, and things could get so escalated, might have to involve the police department in on some things. So I don't think there's any one spot we can point at here. I think it's, as this whole epidemic is changing, this is going to change as it goes too. So I think it's going to be multifaceted on that side of it.
So I have one question for Chris. I thought about this after our morning session, and I'm sorry I'm not trying to blindside you with it, but I just thought of it. Did you guys make any provisions in Cambridge for tower cranes? Did you contemplate what they should do if they have a tower crane on their site? Or is that something that needs to be addressed?
That's a great question. Forgive me for not being prepared. I did hear some scuttlebutt talk that went on that. The best of my knowledge, they're sitting idle, but I do believe that the construction management team, that entity, is allowed to have that operator go in and do what they need to do, because I don't think they can just sit. Again, I'm not in that field, but I think there's some certain things, especially the lights, the security lights. I don't know if they're for the aircraft or whatever that is, but there's some certain things that had to be in place, and I believe those folks are allowed to do that. But as far as, going as far as extreme, if you will, as physically dismantling, that hasn't come down that pike yet.
Okay.
Thanks. This just illustrates what a fluid situation this is, and we're all kind of learning on the fly. And I would say if there's anybody out there that has any ideas on tower cranes, or if there's anything that you think of or discover that needs to be addressed in the demobilization plan that we haven't talked about, please reach out to me or Chris and let us know, and we certainly can put that information out through the Construction Fire Safety Coalition website.
Yes, and you've hit it on the nail on the head about this being fluid, and something that many have not experienced during their lifetime is this, what we're going through right now. Here's a question: is sprinkler system testing and approval before activation, is that correct? It was mentioned on slide 6 or 7 about activating the sprinkler. Should it be tested before activating?
I think that there is a difference of opinion on that topic. Me personally, I think that if it is working and the building is conditioned and you have or you have a location that isn't a location where the climate would have pipes freeze, I would say whether it's commissioned or not to put it on, but that's a decision that has a lot of factors in it. I know that that there were building fires, construction fires in the past where it had been inspected and it was commissioned, and the owner chose, or the contractor chose, to leave it off because it hadn't been monitored by the fire alarm yet, and they were afraid that if a head got knocked off or there was a leak, they wouldn't discover it and it would do a lot of damage to water damage. But then they had fire, and then it wound up being a multi-million-dollar loss.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a decision that's really fact specific, but I would say that the construction fires, the multifamily construction fires I've seen where the sprinkler system was commissioned or approved or installed but not turned on, those fires could have been extinguished with one head had it been on.
Oh. Okay, here's another one. While a site is shuttered, does the authority having jurisdiction, do they do periodic checks on it while it's shuttered?
I'll let Chris talk about what their plans in Cambridge are.
All right, thanks, Ray. Yeah, Michelle, and I kind of alluded into that. That's where we're headed. I believe I'll be able to have the letters that I put out, the emails put out, they could be public to add and get them filtered through Ray and then get to you folks into the Construction Fire Safety Coalition. We let them know that politely, as this continues, the situation that we're in, that, spot checks would take place. It wasn't intended that coming out to find compliance issues for violation purposes, more of an education and, a twofold. We're coming out so we can be familiar on our end. And hey, by the way, we spotted this. What can you do to get this rectified? So I think it's that handshake approach that we're trying to go with. So the short answer, that was long-winded, but the short answer is yes. Just like any other program, everything needs follow-up, and somewhere, the listeners will have to figure out where they fit in this, whether it's going to be coming from a staff fire prevention bureau or dropping it onto the local fire companies, or a mixture of both, which is what we're doing. We're doing a combination of both. And they'll be out there, again, not with the sense of eyes going out there to say, hey, you violated this, we're going to write you up, millions of dollars worth of fines, more on the aspect of, hey, this is where we're at, this got missed, can we get this rectified so it doesn't continue to go on too much longer?
Yeah. And another question, do you recommend the use of temporary fire detection systems on the site during shutdown? I think you touched on this, but.
Yes, there's technology out there. It's very effective. They are very versatile in as much as you can attach them to metal, you can strap them to beams or columns, and they're Wi-Fi enabled. They usually measure for or check for 16 different or 12 to 16 different channels of data, including heat rate of rise, smoke, humidity, and because they're Wi-Fi enabled, they can send messages and they can be monitored remotely, which is key nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
And they could also send messages if the heat rate of rise went off the charts. It could automatically notify the fire department. And the technology is relatively cheap, and I know you can rent it, you don't have to buy it. And some of these folks, they don't put it throughout the whole place. What they do is they put it in the areas of active construction during construction site. Now, this would probably be a situation where you want to put it throughout the place because the place is going to be sitting empty unless you have a guard service. So I'm a big proponent of that technology.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
Good. So we are about over a quarter of the hour after the hour. Just one final question regarding resources for the audience after the webinar. Are there any resources that are available perhaps on the lights out criteria, anything like that?
By the end of the week, we're going to have information on a demobilization plan, probably a template plan, on the Construction Fire Safety Coalition website, www.firesafety.org. And once the recording of this webinar is edited and whatever you guys do to it, it's going to be parked on the homepage of the Construction Fire Safety Coalition website, as well as the American Wood Council website. So, so there will be resources out there that you can look into, and the template, the mobilization plan will be in Word, so it can be downloaded. You can slap your logo on it, tweak it for local conditions, whatever you want to do to it, but it gives a lot of good guidance if your local officials make the decision to shutter construction. And once again, we're not advocating it. We're not saying do it or don't do it. This is just a program if that decision's been made locally.
Great. And Chris, do you have anything to add to that you'd like to suggest, or good to go?
Ray and I had talked. We touched on it again. It's fluid. Hopefully, as things come in and as things evolve, we'll be able to get them, publicated, get them over to you folks where you'll have them at the ready. The only real message I have right now is for folks to keep their distance. You can love everybody, but stay apart from everybody.
Yeah.
Stay safe. Wash your hands often.
Great. Well, thank you both so much, Chris and Ray. I mean, this was a last-minute decision to host this webinar, and we greatly appreciate your contribution in presenting on this very important topic. And so we'll close.
Thank you, Michelle, and the education team. You guys did a great job putting this together.
Oh, yeah.
Very little lead time.
Yes, between Marcy Weber, who was excellent in putting this together, it was quite a feat, but we appreciate everybody attending.